Secrets whispered on the digital waves. See the living history on the screen. Old melodies igniting the spark. Transported photos full of stories.
When the Beatles were at the height of their fame in the 1960s, it was common for their albums to be released in two versions, mono and stereo. This may sound strange to today's listeners, accustomed to the stereo standard, but back then, most people still listened to music in mono. So what's the difference between mono and stereo? Mono, short for monaural, sound is recorded and played back on a single audio channel, meaning that all the elements of the music are mixed and played together through a single speaker. Stereo, short for stereophonic, on the other hand, uses two or more channels to create a sense of spatiality and direction in the sound. In a stereo system, different elements of the music can be played back through different speakers, giving the impression that the instruments and voices are distributed throughout the room. So why did the Beatles bother to release their albums in both formats? And why do some fans still swear that the mono versions are superior? To understand this, we need to go back in time and examine the context in which these recordings were made, the technologies available at the time, and how the band itself approached the recording process. By the way, speaking of mono mixes, have you ever heard of the famous Dr. Abbott's recordings? This is the pseudonym of a mysterious group of fans who have dedicated themselves to creating incredible remasters of Beatles albums, with a special focus on mono versions. Mono is the standard in the 60s. If you're a Beatles fan, you've probably heard about mono mixes of their albums. But why did they exist, anyway? Well, to understand this, we need to go back in time and put ourselves in the shoes of a listener in the 60s. Back then, most sound equipment was very different from what we have today. Both radios and record players usually had only one speaker, which meant they reproduced sound in mono. Stereo did exist, but it was a newer and more expensive technology, usually reserved for high-end equipment. So when the Beatles were growing up and first becoming interested in music, mono was the standard. It was how they heard their favorite artists on the radio and on records. It was only natural, then, that they would want their own music to sound good in this format, too. In addition, mono had some technical advantages. Because all the elements of the song were mixed on a single channel, it was easier to control the volume and balance between instruments and vocals. Sound engineers could create a more cohesive and impactful mix without having to worry about the spatial distribution of the sound. In fact, stereo was invented by English engineer Alan Blumlein, who worked for EMI. Blumlein developed stereo recording in the 1930s, but the technology didn't start to be used commercially until after World War II. Initially for classical music recordings. Of course, over the years, stereo became more popular and affordable. But even so, for much of the Beatles' career, mono remained the primary format. It was the one the band and their producers devoted most of their time and attention to in the studio. So the next time you hear someone say they prefer the Beatles' mono mixes, remember that it's not just a matter of personal taste. It's also a way to experience this iconic music the way it was originally conceived and enjoyed by millions of fans in the 1960s. The evolution of the Beatles recordings. When the Beatles began recording their first albums, they still didn't have much studio experience. That's why they relied heavily on producer George Martin and sound engineers to handle the mixing. The band would record their parts and then leave the technical work to these professionals. But over time, the Beatles became more curious and involved in the recording process. They began to participate in the mixing sessions and experiment with innovative studio techniques. The result was that the songs became increasingly sophisticated and creative. The interesting thing is that, even with all this evolution, the Beatles continued to think mainly about the mono format. It was for this that they created and refined their mixes. They wanted each element of the song to have its right place in the sound spectrum, from the vocals to the background instruments. Many times, the band didn't even participate in the stereo mixes, which were done later by the sound engineers. For the Beatles, the important thing was that the mono version sounded perfect. Stereo was almost an afterthought, done without the band's presence or approval. This preference for mono even influenced the way they composed and arranged songs. For example, backing vocals were recorded and mixed to blend seamlessly with the lead vocals, creating a distinctive wall of sound effect. Guitars, bass, and drums were balanced to form a solid, cohesive foundation. So when you listen to a Beatles song, especially from their later albums, remember that every detail of the mix was carefully planned and executed. It was like creating a work of sonic art, with each stroke of sound having its own purpose and impact. And the interesting thing is that, even with all the advances in stereo, this meticulous and artisanal approach to mixing in mono continues to influence artists and producers to this day. It's a lesson in how simplicity and attention to detail can create true musical masterpieces. Differences between mono and stereo versions. Can you really tell much difference between the mono and stereo versions of Beatles songs? Well, in some cases, yes. One of the main differences between mono and stereo recordings is the sense of spatiality. In mono, we basically have the perception of volume, closer or further away, while in stereo, in addition to volume, we also have the perception of laterality, left or right. This is especially evident when listening to music with headphones. In stereo, each element of the music can be positioned at a different point in space, creating a wider and more detailed sound image. A famous example is the song Eleanor Rigby. In the stereo mix, the vocals are all thrown to one side, while the string arrangements are on the other. There is a strange feeling of emptiness in the middle. In the mono version, however, everything is well centered and integrated, creating a much more immersive atmosphere. Another interesting example is the song A Day in the Life. You know those orchestral crescendos that appear in the middle of the song? In stereo, you can clearly hear them when they start, but in mono, they appear more subtly and gradually, taking the listener by surprise. It is a much more impactful effect. In general, mono mixes of the Beatles tend to have more punch and energy. Since all the elements are together in a single channel, they gain cohesion and extra strength. It's that feeling that the music is jumping out of the speakers. On the other hand, stereo versions, especially the older ones, can sound a little artificial and disconnected. The excessive separation of instruments and vocals can end up diluting the emotional impact of the songs. It's no wonder that George Martin himself once said that you've never really heard Sgt. Pepper until you've heard it in mono. Of course, there are exceptions. Some more psychedelic and experimental songs, like Tomorrow Never Knows and Strawberry Fields Forever, work well with the confusion of stereo. But overall, for most fans and experts, mono is still the most authentic and impactful way to hear the Beatles. So if you're one of those who only know the stereo versions, it's worth giving mono a chance. It's like hearing these iconic songs from a new perspective, closer to the band's original vision. Legacy and modern remixes. Over time, stereo became increasingly popular, and the Beatles themselves eventually embraced the trend. The Abbey Road album, released in 1969, was the first one they recorded and mixed with stereo in mind. But the legacy of mono versions lived on among hardcore fans. For decades, heated debates over which mix was the correct or definitive one were common. Some even argued that listening to the Beatles in stereo was almost a betrayal of the band's artistic vision. Fortunately, in recent years, a new perspective on this issue has emerged. Giles Martin, son of legendary producer George Martin, began working on modern remixes of Beatles albums to celebrate special dates, such as the 50th anniversary of Sgt. Pepper's. What's cool is that Giles didn't just clean up the sound or improve the technical quality of the recordings. He went further, using today's technology to bring out details and nuances that were somewhat hidden in the original mixes. Suddenly, we began to hear Paul's bass more clearly, to better distinguish each vocal harmony, to notice sound effects that had previously gone unnoticed. It's as if the songs took on a new life, revealing layers of complexity and genius that were always there, but that we couldn't fully appreciate. Some of these remixes, such as the one for the White Album, are true works of art in themselves. It's impressive to compare them with previous versions and realize how much they have been improved and valued. Conclusion. So, what can we learn from this whole story of the Beatles' mono and stereo versions? Well, first, that context matters. To understand the band's artistic choices, we also need to understand the technological and cultural moment in which they were inserted. Second, that the way a song is mixed and presented can have a huge impact on how we perceive and feel it. It's not just a technical issue, but also aesthetic and emotional. And third, that it's always worth opening yourself up to new experiences and possibilities. Even with a work as well known and celebrated as that of the Beatles, surprises and rediscoveries can still arise. Whether listening to a mono version for the first time or enjoying a modern remix, the important thing is to maintain that curiosity and love for the music. In the end, whether in mono, stereo, 8D, or any other format they invent in the future, what really matters is the connection we create with these incredible songs. They have the power to move us, to make us think, to transport us to other places and times. That is the true magic of the Beatles, and it will continue to enchant and inspire generations, no matter how we choose to listen to it. So let's celebrate this band that revolutionized music and popular culture like no other. And long live mono, stereo, and everything in between. Like, share, and subscribe to the channel.